Welcome back to Zoom 9 News. I'm Jordan Slayer.
I'm Zachary Howard.
And today we're going to discuss why cochlear implants are strongly opposed by many members of the deaf community.
First, to get started, to get a better understanding of this topic, we got to go over a couple things, starting with, what are cochlear implants?
Thanks, Zach. If we're going to talk about the perspectives that people have about cochlear implants, then we should first address what cochlear implants really are.
Right.
This information comes from the American Speech, Language, and Hearing Association database. Cochlear implants are devices that are surgically implanted to give people access to auditory information when hearing aids aren't a viable option, and if the hearing loss is great enough.
That's crazy.
On the outside of the head, there's a microphone that takes in the sound in the person's environment, which is then sent to the processor to be processed into digital signal. The signal then goes from the processor to the transmitter and then to the receiver, which is placed right behind the ear.
Right behind the ear? Like right there?
The signal is then transmitted to electrodes that are placed in the cochlea, or also called the inner ear, which then causes the auditory nerve to react. This causes the signal that was transmitted from the cochlear implant to be sent to the brain to be processed as sound.
Wow, that's crazy. There must be a lot of history about cochlear implants, right, Jordan?
I was just getting to that. This information comes from Eshraghi and others from the National Center of Biotechnology Information Database.
Whoa, that's a big old database.
In 1972, the first single-channel cochlear implant was introduced. Around 1,000 people were implanted, which includes several hundred children. Overall, this allowed people to be better at speech reading, but it did very little to help with word recognition. In 1984, the first multi-channel cochlear implant was introduced. This device was worn as a headband and it consisted of 22 banded contacts. This device was not sophisticated enough to be used as 22 separate channels, though, so this was not considered to be too much of a success.
Isn't there more channels in the hearing? Not just 22?
Pretty much, but we had to get down to more basic stuff at this time. At the same time as this was being created, another multi-channel system was developed, which consisted of 6 intracochlear electrodes that were attached to a permanent sound processor. It had a microphone, a series of 4 bypass filters, and an analog electronic circuit that controlled the maximum output that the electrodes could have. This was honestly considered crude compared to today's technology. Speech recognition was a lot lower with this system than the systems that are used today.
Wow.
Research has been done to help improve the intracochlear array and stimulation mode, and refining the processing strategies to help people in need of cochlear implants to hear to the best of their abilities. According to ASHA, speech recognition of people with cochlear implants that were developed recently was around 80%, which is fantastic compared to the devices of the past.
That's crazy.
The history of cochlear implants was brought up because cochlear implantation is permanent. People that were implanted when it was first being developed are not able to be so-called upgraded to a new and improved cochlear implant, and they also cannot decide that they do not want the cochlear implant anymore.
It's just stuck in them, right?
Yep.
That's crazy. Wow, that was really interesting, Jordan. Do you know a lot about the deaf culture?
No, do you?
Well, I got a story to tell you, and history and all that good stuff. First, to define deaf culture, we have to define a couple of other things first.
Oh, okay.
All right, first, we got to define what a culture is. And then afterwards, we got to define what a community is. All right, Paul and Quigley article Deafness in Education talks about culture. They define culture as a group of people who share the same attributes and ideals. Richard S. Tyler's article on cochlear implants and deaf culture often refers to community as a geographic location. Although members may share the same values, it is important not to note that typical communities are heterogeneous. But in the deaf community, not all members need to be deaf. Even when discussing deaf culture, using a lowercase d stands for a completely different meaning than using a capital one. The word deaf with the lowercase refers to an audiological lack of hearing, while the word deaf with an uppercase meaning refers to a cultural identity. The capital D has more of a powerful meaning. It's like when you yell, "Hey!" It's like I'm saying that with like a capital and a couple exclamation marks.
That makes sense.
Right? Instead of just saying, "Hey."
Wow.
It's powerful. It's a powerful meaning.
Exactly.
The most important attribute about the deaf culture is its language itself, American Sign Language, also referred to as ASL. The deaf culture also centers around identification and unity with other people who are deaf. Due to these shared establishments, many deaf individuals primarily socialize among themselves and have limited social interactions with people from the majority culture. 95% of deaf marriages involve two deaf partners. The deaf culture values, behaviors, and traditionals include valuing children who are deaf as in the future of people and deaf culture. Deaf culture therefore refers to the use of ASL, in addition to any other communication modalities the child may have. Support for bilingual and ASL and English education of children who are deaf, so they are competent with both languages, not just the one.
Okay.
This information comes from the National Center of Biotechnology Information.
That's really interesting.
That's what I'm saying. You learn something new every day, right?
Right. And so, since you know a lot about the perspective of cochlear implants with people from the deaf culture, I'm going to talk about the perspective of people that aren't in the deaf culture.
That's great.
This information comes from Deborah Nussbaum from the National Deaf Education Center at Gallaudet University. Generally, people that are not part of the deaf community tend to be in support of cochlear implants. Professionals that are in support of cochlear implants look into the language benefits of cochlear implants most. Typically, the earlier that the child is implanted, the more language benefits that can be gained from cochlear implants, since that is a crucial time for language development in children. The earliest that a child can be implanted is around 12 months old, and around 14 to 15 months old if it is when cochlear implants are typically turned on. Many members of the deaf community find this very unethical because at this age, the child is not able to choose whether or not they want to be implanted.
I think it's interesting that they don't turn them on right away. They wait a certain time to turn it on.
Yeah.
Why do they do that?
That's because they need time to heal from the surgery.
Okay.
Yeah. And they need it to be set before they actually turn it on and make sure that the child is ready.
Okay.
Yes. And this is a huge debate because if they don't get the implants when they're very young, then they're at risk at not gaining as much benefit from the cochlear implants. From the article published by Nussbaum, it was mentioned that children that were implanted at an older age and were already avid ASL communicators were less likely to be able to learn by listening than if they were implanted at an earlier age.
That's crazy. So let me tell you something about the view of cochlear implants within the deaf culture. While many people praise the cochlear, there's tons of videos on the YouTube about cochlear implant activation videos. On the basis they are very sensationalizing and they're praised, but other people oppose them for being oppressive and offensive. For these critics, deafness is not defined by a lack of ability to hear, but rather a distinct cultural identity. Many deaf cultures are deeply offended by what they perceive to be inherently a negative implication of cochlear implants. Some people see deafness as a medical disability that should be cured rather than a cultural identity that should be celebrated and respected. There's no middle ground on this aspect. There's one side that is a culture and they identify as that culture, and then there's the other side that think if you can fix it, why not? And we've discussed this in our class about how that's not okay.
Yes.
And then on a video, there was a YouTube video titled "Deaf People Hearing Sound for the First Time," and it was like a compilation video, and it amassed 6.6 million views. And a commentator by the name of Tison passionately rebuked, saying, "Can someone say inspirational porn? We don't need to be fixed, so it's easier on you hearing people with the thing that causes so many issues. How about actually learning to communicate with us?" So that just goes to show that there's no middle ground. It's crazy. It's a very touchy subject.
Yeah.
So not only do many deaf culturists find the assumption that they need to be fixed or cured insulting, but some contend that cochlear implants threatens to destroy their own culture, which in the broader things makes a lot more sense. Because if you identify with the culture and you're trying to get rid of it, you're basically attacking a whole culture that has been defined by this ability.
That makes
So,
sense.
because 90% of the deaf children have hearing parents, the cultural transmission of deaf culture does not occur within the families, but rather through deaf institutions. As the cochlear implants will inevitably lead to a decline in ASL speakers, there is a fear that fewer people will participate in deaf institution, which as a result would destroy the deaf culture as a whole.
That makes sense.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
So, I have a couple questions, Jordan.
Oh, yeah?
So, will cochlear implants restore your hearing back to full if you get them?
Well, no. While cochlear implants do not restore normal hearing, they do provide sound. It may sound foreign at first, but after a while, the sound becomes more normal and comprehensible. When the implant is first turned on, the patient can hear sound, but it can take a while for the brain to understand speech, especially for a child. For a child who lost his hearing just as he was beginning to learn speech and language, he will have to relearn how to hear. Cochlear implants can provide more access to speech information than previously received from a hearing aid. Practice with the implant and supplemental listening therapy is as effective to obtain the maximum benefit from this device.
Huh.
So, Zach, do you think that the deaf culture is opposed to cochlear implants?
I can't speak for everyone, but I can say that from the readings and the research that I have done on this assignment, that for the most, the deaf culture is not particularly a fan of cochlear implants for sure. It threatens, it's, as you said before, like, it threatens their identity as a whole. And another factor of cochlear implants is that they are not as effective as people think they are. These people paint a picture is that you throw these cochlear implants on and bam, I can hear. But that's not the case.
Wow.
Your hearing is very limited, and individuals who have implants do not hear the same as regular hearing, as the hearing population in general. Like you've mentioned before with the 22 channels, and then it's not like we have 300 plus channels in our hearing. Like we're able to hear as a whole. So when you're only limited to like 40 or 50 of those, it's a complete difference, you know?
Yeah.
And once the implants are on, once you take those implants off, it's not like, oh, you could still hear. Once you take those implants off, you're deaf. You can't hear anything.
That makes sense.
That's it. It's like that movie, I think it's called The Quiet Place.
Yeah.
With John Krasinski, Jim from The Office. So there was a scene where it's a spooky movie. There's a scene where the girl, she was deaf and she had to take off her cochlear implants to get in the shower or something. And when stuff was going down when she was taking off her, like taking a shower and stuff, and she couldn't hear. And so when she was taking a shower and everything, a monster was coming in and rummaging through everything, and she couldn't hear anything that was going on, and she could have died because of this. I know it's just a movie, but it's still like you're not able to hear your surroundings even though you have these things on, which is supposed to help you hear.
Yeah.
So that's a thing. And then like another thing about cochlear implants is that they don't really describe the amount of therapy an individual has to take, especially when you get these at a young age. You know how much therapy and like it's mind-boggling for a child to go through that much therapy, especially at such a young age. Am I right?
Yes, exactly.
Wow, Jordan, didn't we learn a lot today?
Yes, I did. Wow.
It's crazy what we can do with such time. Well, that's the story from Zoom 9 News.
Back to you, Teak.
Yeah.